And did you see anything which might indicate to you where the shots came from?
The smoke came from behind the hedge, and I saw a puff of smoke still lingering underneath the trees in front of the wooden fence.
Is this the exact spot you were standing on November 22nd, Mr. Holland?
That's correct. This is the exact spot that I was standing November the 22nd, waiting for the parade.
And where did you hear that third shot come from?
Right over about 20 or 30 feet from the other end of that little picket fence.
And where was the smoke that you saw?
It drifted right out underneath those green trees, those two trees.
From behind the fence?
From behind the fence. Immediately after the president's car came underneath this overpass, four of us broke a run around this fence to find out if we could see anybody leaving the area. Jumped this steam line, this pipe. One man right behind me jumped, and another one jumped right on top of him.
Fell on top of him?
Fell on top of him. We were jumping over the bumpers, over the hood of the cars to work our way to the spot that we saw the smoke and heard the shot. Then we came up to the wooden fence.
Mr. Holland, did you remain behind here for a while when the police officers were searching the area?
Approximately 15 minutes before I had to go back to my office. There was about 40 or 50 people around here searching.
And what did you find here?
A lot of footprints behind this car, mud on the bumpers. And I looked around to see if I could find some empty shells or any evidence of a shot being fired and the bullet shell rejected from the gun. And this is where I saw the smoke from the third shot.
The Warren Commission published just a very small portion of your testimony and used your testimony as proof that no shots could have come from behind the fence. Did they accurately and fairly use your testimony?
They are wrong, because my testimony, and I made it very clear, that there was a fourth shot fired, and one of those shots came from behind that picket fence.
Right here?
Right here on this spot.
And where did you think you heard the shots come from?
From behind the overpass over there, triple overpass. That's where I thought the shots were coming from.
And where did you see the man run?
Over behind that wooden fence, past the cars, and over behind the Texas Depository building.
Did you give that information to the Dallas Sheriff's Department on the very day of the assassination?
Yes, I did. I'd say in about 30 minutes after the assassination.
Were you ever called as a witness by the Warren Commission?
No, sir. No, sir.
The final shot had to come from the grassy knoll somewhere in that area to hit him in the side of over his ear. There was at least one shot came from that direction, and it took the top of his head off and blew his brains out and backwards. And I would swear that over my mother's grave to this day.
From the results of what I saw, his head exploding, absolutely it exploded. I would think that the shot came from behind the picket fence, which borders the top of the grassy knoll.
As the presidential limousine was rounding the curve on Elm Street, there was a loud explosion. At the time, I didn't know what it was, but it sounded like a loud firecracker or a gunshot. And it sounded like it came from the left and in front of us, towards the wooden fence. And there was a puff of smoke that came underneath the trees on the embankment. I was talking with a patrolman Foster at the time, and as soon as we heard the shots, we ran around to the wooden fence. And when we got there, there was no one there, but there was footprints in the mud around the fence, and there was footprints on the wooden 2x4 railing on the fence.
Were you questioned by the Dallas police on that day?
Yes, I was.
Did you give your name to the Dallas police?
Yes, I did.
Did you tell them what you've just told me?
Yes, I did.
Were you subsequently questioned by agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
About a month later, I was questioned by the FBI.
Did you tell them what you told me and what you told the Dallas police?
Yes, I did.
Were you ever called as a witness by the Warren Commission?
No, sir, I wasn't.
Harvey had written in a memo at one point when he was running the executive action program that he wanted to use Corsicans.
Wanted to use what?
Corsicans.
Yeah.
As hitmen. Do you think it's possible that when he was in Rome that he might have recruited a Corsican assassin to kill Kennedy?
Yes. It is possible. You're not an immediate suspect in the case of a capital crime.
Right, because he was in Rome.
Is that understandable?
Yeah.
Okay.
Was known simply as the Babushka Lady.
I had President Kennedy right in my zoom lens. You know, I could see Connally anytime. He's a Texan, right? Appreciate him, love him, he's great, but I wanted to see the president.
In the carnival atmosphere surrounding the motorcade, there was no indication of the danger lurking seconds away in Dealey Plaza.
When I first heard a noise, I was not aware that that was a shot being fired, and maybe perhaps that's why I continued to film, because I thought it was a backfire or a firecracker. I mean, I wasn't used to being around guns. I did not realize that those were shots until I saw in the frame of my camera President Kennedy's head come off, the back of his head. Then I realized that that was a shot. I don't know how many I heard. I know where I thought the shots came from. Was the picket fence area around that large tree somewhere on the other side of those steps, but in the picket fence area. There was a figure there and there was smoke there. I will always believe that the man that shot President Kennedy was standing somewhere in the picket fence area.
After the assassination, Beverly was contacted at work by FBI agents who took her undeveloped film and promised to return it within 10 days. She has not seen it since.
From the position that I was filming, I had the best shot of the assassination, and probably the only one that had a real good shot of the grassy knoll. And probably would be a lot of unanswered questions answered if my film could be found.
Fortunately, a few feet to Beverly's left, Mary Ann Moorman in the dark coat took her picture a split second after the president had been fatally struck in the head. Although frequently examined by the FBI, her historic snapshot was too widely publicized to disappear.
We know that the president's car was in the center.
Its dramatic secret, however, has only recently been uncovered. After 5 years of intensive study of the Moorman picture by two researchers in Texas, Jack White and Gary Mack, there is at last convincing evidence of a gunman up on the grassy knoll.
Here is the guy that we call Badge Man, and it appears to me that from our study of it, his waist is right at the top of the wooden fence.
Gary Mack was the first to isolate the image, now known as Badge Man.
What I was looking at, to a lot of people, might have just been like looking at an ink blot or something. And all of a sudden, I started to see eyes and ears and forehead and hair. And little by little, the pieces of this image started to make sense to me. And that's when I first called Jack. And with his photographic work doing the blow-ups, we could see more and more and more detail. And at one point, we realized that this fellow was probably wearing a police uniform, or some type of uniform that was close enough to what the Dallas police were wearing, so that he could pass as a police officer.
And in 1963, Gordon Arnold was a 22-year-old serviceman, just out of training camp and en route to a posting in Alaska. This is his first film interview.
On that particular morning, what happened was I came downtown and I thought there was going to be a parade. So what I did was I parked my vehicle back here in this parking lot, and I intentionally walked to this particular corner because I wanted to take pictures of the parade off of the railroad bridge. Well, this is about as far as I got, because what happened is when I got my leg to about this position, a man came around the corner off the bridge, had a suit on, and he turned around and he told me that I wasn't going to be there. And I guess I was younger and more spunky at that time, because I told him, you and who else is going to keep me off the bridge? And he pulled out an identification card and he said, I'm with the CIA. And I said, well, that's enough muscle, I'll leave. So I turned around and brought my leg back over like this, I walked down the fence line here about halfway. And I was looking over the fence to see if I could get a good shot of the parade. And he come back up and he told me, he says, "I told you to get out of this area." And I said, "Okay." So I walked the complete length of the fence, got around on the other side. That's when I started to line up my frame so that I could take the picture of the parade. I had been panning shots through here so that I could get whatever was going to come down the street. And I saw that it was the President of the United States. And as I was panning down this direction, just as I got to about this position, a shot come right past my left ear. And that meant it would have had to have come from this direction. And that's when I fell down. And to me, it seemed like a second shot was at least fired over my head. There's a bunch of report going on in this particular area at that time. And what happened was that while I was laying on the ground, it seemed like a gentleman came from this particular direction. And I thought it was a police officer because he had a uniform of a police officer. But he didn't wear a hat, and he had dirty hands. But it didn't really matter much at that time because with him crying like he was, and with him shaking when he had the weapon in his hand, I think I'd have gave him almost anything except the camera because that was my mother's. And literally what the man did was kick me and asked me if I was taking a picture. I told him that I was. And when I looked at the weapon, it was about that big around, and I decided I'd let him go ahead and have the film. I gave it to him, and then he went back off in this direction. I went off in this direction. And 3 days later, I was in Alaska. And I didn't come back to the United States for about 18 months.
This colorized version of the Badgeman picture was shown to Gordon Arnold for the first time. He has always believed there was no proof of his presence on the knoll that day.
Looks like a soldier in summer uniform with an overseas cap on. It looks like it would have been my uniform. And it looks like there's a camera. Or there's something up in front of the face. It looks like a white spot. If it's a flash, it would be like off of a muzzle flash. This looks like a police officer because that would be the badge. That would be the arm emblem. Would this fella back here be the railroad man I asked you about this morning? Because when I was walking to the site, and I had never told anybody that I had, when we were out there filming, it reminded me that there was a railroad worker just standing out there by the railroad tracks. But it looks like somebody's taking a picture. Yeah, I couldn't figure out why would I be standing crooked until I flipped that up, and if that's a muzzle blast or flash, then whoever's standing there would have been a fool to stand up straight. He'd been trying to get away from harm's way is what it boils down to. And that could very well be me. Son of a gun. That would be the closest thing that I've ever... To be honest with you, the picture bothers me because if this is a true thing of what has occurred, then I could be the only one that... Stop, man. They killed the president. And to be honest with you, if I'd have known this,
when to give the interview.
However, his story is confirmed by another eyewitness, Ed Hoffman, a deaf mute who is interviewed here for the first time.
I'd gotten off work early because I had a dentist's appointment. I was traveling down the freeway here, and I remembered that President Kennedy was coming to visit Dallas. I parked my car here. I realized at this spot that I would be able to see Kennedy pass close by. I stood here and waited, and I was looking towards where he would be coming from. I suddenly saw two men who looked suspicious directly over there in the car park.
25 years ago, these trees did not obscure the view. From his position at the side of the freeway, Ed Hoffman could clearly see the car park area behind the grassy knoll.
I saw a man standing here, wearing a black hat and a blue jacket. I saw a puff of smoke and I thought it was a cigarette, but it wasn't. He had a gun and he walked towards the railroad. He tossed the gun to the second man. Then he turned and straightened his jacket, adjusted his hat, and walked casually away. The man with the striped shirt, the railroad shirt, walked over to the electrical box with the gun. He took the gun apart. He put it in a toolbox. He then walked slowly away in the direction of the railroad track. When the motorcade passed by below me here, I realized that Kennedy had been shot. I was horrified. I saw a policeman standing on the railroad bridge, and I tried to get his attention, but he didn't see me. So I got in my car and drove to the area where I had seen the two men. But there were so many people there, and I couldn't find them. I went to the FBI to tell them what I had seen. They didn't want me to say anything. They offered me money to keep quiet. They didn't understand that it was more important for me to tell them what I'd seen. It was hard for me to communicate with them. I do feel that the two men I saw were working together, and that the one with the gun behind the fence was the man who shot President Kennedy.
Writer Steve Ravel's lone pursuit of Kennedy's killers began 4 years ago. His first breakthrough came when he was given the name of a French drug smuggler in prison in the United States, who, it was rumored, had some first-hand knowledge of the president's assassination.
The initial turning point was the first meeting that I had with the French narcotics trafficker at Leavenworth Penitentiary. His name was Christian David. He had been a member of the old French Connection heroin network. He had then been a leader of the Corsican drug trafficking network in South America, known as the Latin Connection. And he had also been an intelligence agent for a number of intelligence services around the world. In exchange for my help in finding him an attorney to represent him against the possibility of his deportation to France after he finished his sentence at Leavenworth, he agreed to give me a certain amount of information concerning the assassination based upon his own knowledge. The first thing that he told me, very reluctantly, and only after 4 or 5 hours of my arguing with him, was that he was aware that there had been a conspiracy to murder the president, and indeed in May or June of 1963 in Marseille, he had been offered the contract to kill President Kennedy. That was the initial breakthrough, if you will. He was eventually deported to France. I remained in contact with him. I went to Paris to interview him in 2 prisons in Paris. His position was that there were 3 killers and that they had been hired on a contract which had been placed with the leader of the Corsican Mafia of Marseille, a man named Antoine Guérigny. Guérigny, he said, was asked to supply 3 assassins, high-quality, experienced killers, to murder the president. He told me that he had been in Marseille in May or June of 1963, and that every evening he went to Antoine Guérini's club on the old port of Marseille to meet people who owed him money. One evening, Guérini sent for him, asked him to come to his office, which was above the club. Guérini told him that he had an important contract, and he asked David if he were interested. David said, who's the contract on? And Guérini said, an American politician. David asked, well, is it a congressman, a senator? And Guérini said, higher than that. La plus haute légume, he said, the highest vegetable. At that point, of course, David knew who he was talking about. David asked him where was the contract to be carried out, and when Guérini said it would be done inside the United States, David refused on the grounds that that was much too dangerous. Now, David initially would only give me the first name of one of the three men on the grounds that two of the three were still alive, and since they were members of this Corsican milieu, which has a code of silence and a code of vendetta, if he named them, he himself would be murdered. However, he did agree to give me the first name of the third man who he said was dead, and that man, he said, was named Lucien. And through contacts that I made in the journalistic and police and intelligence communities, I was able to determine that this Lucien was, in fact, a Corsican drug trafficker and killer of the 1960s and 70s by the name of Lucien Sarti. Sarti had been killed in Mexico City in 1972. I confronted David with the name of Sarti, and he in effect confirmed that that was the man he had referred to. He was an extremely reckless, very daring man, known and despised even by his colleagues for taking enormous chances. But that same recklessness made him one of the most successful contract killers and drug traffickers of his era.
Having identified Sarti, Christian David, fearing for his life, refused to name the other two assassins recruited to kill Kennedy. Nonetheless, in successive interviews, he slowly began to reveal how the contract, placed here in Marseille, had been carried out.
In the fall of 1963, the three killers were flown from Marseille to Mexico City, where they spent some 3 or 4 weeks at the house of a contact in Mexico City. He said that they were then driven from Mexico City to the U.S. border at Brownsville, Texas. They crossed the border using Italian passports. He said that they were picked up on the American side of the border at Brownsville by a representative of the Chicago Mafia, with whom they conversed in Italian. They were then driven to Dallas and put up in a safe house which had been prepared for them so as not to leave any hotel records. He said that they spent several days taking photographs of Dealey Plaza, and in the evenings at the safe house they studied the photographs and they arranged what he called a crossfire with 3 guns. On the question of the actual murder, he was reasonably specific that 2 of the assassins were in buildings behind the president's limousine. He did not know which buildings. However, he did specify that one was high and one was low. In fact, he said presque sur l'horizontale, almost on the horizontal. And he went on to add, you can't understand the wounds unless you understand that one of the men was almost on the horizontal. Now, in a separate conversation with David, I asked him, based upon what I knew about Sarti's penchant for changing his appearance, whether Sarti had ever said anything to him about having worn a disguise. And David said, what do you mean by a disguise? I asked him, did Sarti ever indicate that he wore clothing other than he normally would have worn? And David thought about it for a moment and said, he wore a uniform. I asked him what kind of uniform, and he refused to answer. But he did add that on jobs like this, they were always in disguise. He said if, for example, there were a military post nearby, they would dress in military uniforms. He said that there were 4 shots. The first shot was fired from the rear, struck the president in the back. The second shot was also fired from the rear, and as David said, hit the other man in the car. The third shot was fired by Sarti from the front, struck the president in the head. And the 4th shot was fired from the rear and missed the automobile entirely. So his scenario, as he claims to have learned it from the gunman, was 3 guns, 4 shots, 3 hits, 1 miss. He also added at one point that 2 of the shots were fired almost simultaneously. He said that in the moment of panic, which always follows an incident of this kind, they were able to get away from Dealey Plaza and go back to the safe house. Now, he made the specific point that the worst thing that you can do at a moment like that is to try to escape. And so they stayed in their safe house for some 10 days until things quieted down sufficiently, and then they were flown by a private plane from Dallas to Montreal. He said that the people who met them in Montreal were established contacts who were used to moving people in and out of the country, and that from Montreal they returned to Marseille. And I asked him, was there anybody in the world who could substantiate this story? And it was at that point, after thinking about it for a minute, that he advised me to go and look for a man named Michel.
Michel Nicolai could have been anywhere in the world. A former narcotics trafficker turned government informant, he had become a United States federally protected witness and had officially disappeared.
In June of 1986, I, almost by accident, found the one person in the U.S. government who knew where he was, who was a very high official of the Drug Enforcement Administration. In the course of 3 subsequent conversations, among other things, Michel confirmed that Lucien Sarty was one of the 3 killers.
The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. From the lips of Michel Nicolai, Steve now had the names of the other 2 assassins.
At that point, I then went back to David. I gave him all 3 names, and in effect, he confirmed them. When I showed David an aerial photograph of Dealey Plaza, the first thing he said was, "Show me where the railroad bridge is." I pointed out the bridge over Elm Street, and he said that was where Sarty wanted to be. But on the morning of the assassination, the bridge was guarded, and he was forced, as he said, to move on to the little hill with the wooden fence. He took up a position from behind the wooden fence from which he fired 1 shot, and David specified that he used an explosive bullet. Now, he said that Sarty was the only one who used that kind of ammunition, a remark which he refused to explain and which I didn't understand at the time, until I put the question to Michel. When I asked Michel if it were true that Sarty had used an exploding bullet, Michel sighed and said, yes, that was what I had heard.
Yes, it's Lucien Sarty. Me too. I sometimes carried them with me, but I didn't use them.
What was the advantage of having bullets like that?
Well, it makes a larger hole in the body. And when the bullet flattens out, there aren't any traces, no marks, nothing.
On the question of payment, Michel agreed with David that the assassins had been paid in heroin, and he went a bit farther. In my first conversation with him, he indicated that although he did not know it at the time, it was he who converted the heroin payment into cash for the assassins. He indicated, at least initially, that the 3 men had appeared at his apartment in Buenos Aires in the months following the assassination with, as he put it, a substantial quantity of heroin. He was surprised because, to his knowledge, it was the first time that any of the 3 of them had dealt in heroin. But given his reputation for not asking embarrassing questions, he simply agreed to convert the heroin into cash for them.
Did they ever give you any indication about who was behind this contract?
No, they didn't talk to me about that. It was Christian David who told me that it was someone in the mafia, but I don't know who it was.
But it was known more or less generally in this circle of Frenchmen in South America that it was the mafia that was behind it.
Yes.
My own conviction at this point is that the contract probably originated with Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, who placed it in Marseille through his colleague Santos Traficante Jr., who had the closest relations with Antoine Guérini. Beyond that, it seems reasonable that Giancana of Chicago was involved, if we accept David and Michel's idea that the assassins were met at the border by representatives of the Chicago Mafia. And the fact that Sarty's customers were primarily in New York, and the fact that the assassins evidently moved out of the United States through the Montreal corridor, which was very closely linked to the New York Mafia, also suggests that Gambino may have been involved.
In your view, why would they go so far to find assassins for such a job?
In my opinion, to obliterate any traces. Yes, it's more difficult to find foreign killers.
The Mafia had to hire white men for the job, since it was to take place in the American South. which meant that they could not go to the other two centers where one found assassins at that time, namely Beirut and Hong Kong. Secondly, they needed highly experienced, skilled assassins. Thirdly, they needed assassins who, if they were caught, could not directly be tied to the American Mafia, and also who were not known to the American police. And fourthly, once again, if they were caught, assassins who could be counted on not to talk.
When someone has a contract to kill someone, he's not rubbing out the name, he's rubbing out the person. You just have to kill him, that's all. And according to who it is, you get paid more. According to who it is, and that's all.
But after all, it was the President of the United States they were talking about.
If they did it, it's because they didn't give a damn. There are people like David who refused to do it. There were others who didn't refuse.
But Sarti, would he have been capable of that?
Oh, yes. As a killer, he's capable of anything. It's not a question of sentiment. No sentiment with him.
And to my enormous relief, Michel repeated essentially the same story he had told me in front of the DEA official. An official of the FBI then interviewed Michel Nicoly and indicated that he was persuaded by Nicoly's statement. I assumed at that point that given the testimony by credible witnesses, the government would then move toward the indictment and the arrest of the people who had been named. So far as I can tell, since then, nothing has happened. Subsequent to that, I was able to learn from Christian David and other sources that the man who was in charge of the logistics and the organization of this plot was another Marseille gangster, a very important figure, was based here in Marseille for many years, named Paul Mondoloni, who was for many years the liaison between the Guerinis at their headquarters here on the Old Port and the U.S. Mafia, specifically Centros Traficanti. They established that liaison in Havana when Mondoloni ran the Corsican casinos there, and it was sustained later when the Corsicans were thrown out by Castro and they were forced to move to Montreal and establish a heroin smuggling outpost there. Mondoloni would have been the ideal person to have organized and carried out this plot. The men who murdered the President of the United States have been named by witnesses who even the government considers are credible. We have people we can put our hands on, people we can arrest, and nothing is being done about it. And yet until they're arrested and interrogated, and the truth comes from their own lips, if they are in fact guilty, we may never know the resolution of this mystery. We may never have the truth about this matter. And that's a situation that I personally find intolerable.